He was not a huge, frightening bear from the deep forest. Braum was the size of a sturdy child with long, woolly arms, quick paws, and careful eyes. He walked upright most of the time because it made it easier to carry things and to talk to people without shouting. Braum owned exactly 3 treasures. The first was a dark wool vest with a shiny round button. It had been sewn by his aunt many years ago, and it fit him so perfectly that he felt half-dressed without it. The second was a little cap with a bell on the side. The bell was bronze, rubbed smooth by fingers and winters, and when Braum shook his head, it rang in a soft, round voice. Twine. The third was an old wooden sled. It had once been painted white, but now the paint was cracked like a thin layer of ice after many thaws. A narrow piece of pink string was tied to the front, worn and strong. The runners had learned every bump of every hill around town and remembered them in their scars. When Braum sat on this sled, in his vest and cap, one paw lifted as if holding invisible reins, he felt like exactly who he was meant to be. There was only one problem. Winter was late. By this time most years, children would already be sliding down the hills behind the school, and Braum would be sailing beside them, his bell ringing like a small wild star. There would be snow piled on the stone by the lake, snow on the roofs, snow on the reeds that made them bow like old ladies greeting the frost. But this year, the hills were still brown. The lake only wore a lace of ice at the very edge. The sky remained a dull gray blanket that refused to shake anything loose. "It's trying," said Mrs. Hen from her yard, tucking her wings closer. "The air smells like snow." "The air has been smelling like snow for 3 weeks," Braum sighed, sitting on his sled near the path. "Smell is not enough." Children walked past in boots that squeaked on frozen earth instead of crunching. "When the snow comes," they kept saying, "when the snow comes, I'll build a fort. When the snow comes, we'll make lanterns and bury them halfway. When the snow comes, Braum will race us from the top of the big hill." They said it bravely, but Braum could hear the doubt creeping in, quiet as cold under the door. One afternoon, when the wind tasted especially sharp and restless, Braum dragged his sled up onto a flat stone near the lake and sat looking at the empty sky. "Have you misplaced winter?" he asked it politely. "If you have, I'd be happy to help look." The sky did not answer. Skies are bad at direct conversation. But down near the reeds, a voice said, "Complaining to the ceiling again, are you?" A black shape hopped onto the stone. It was Ink, the local crow, feathers glossy, eyes even glossier. "I wasn't complaining," Braum said. "I was, asking for clarification." Ink tilted her head. "Clarification will not make snow stick to the ground." "I know," Braum wrapped his paws around the pink string. "But the hills are waiting, the children are waiting, I'm waiting, and winter is late." Ink clicked her beak. "Then go and fetch it." Braum blinked. "Fetch? Winter? Why not?" Ink hopped along the sled's edge. "Everyone else is sitting around looking up. You have a sled, 2 good paws, and a bell that can probably wake at least one important thing. Go to the North Hill. That's where the snow gate is." Braum stared at her. "There's no such thing as a snow gate." Ink scratched her throat thoughtfully. "You are wearing a cap with a bell that talks, a vest with a magic button. Don't look at me like that. Of course it's magic. You never lose it, and you're still doubting the existence of a gate?" He rubbed his snout. "Have you actually seen it?" "I've seen something. A long time ago, when I was a fledgling. A place on the highest hill where the air feels thick and the first snow always falls. Call it a gate, a window, a hole in the clouds. Names are lighter than the things they sit on." Braum thought of the bare hills and the children's hopeful voices. His chest felt tight in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. If there is a place where the snow waits and I have legs and a sled and nothing better to do, then I suppose I should go and knock. Ink gave a pleased croak. At last, some sense. "But the North Hill is far," Braum added. "Beyond the town, beyond the old quarry. It's a long pole for one small bear." Ink spread her wings. "Then it's good that you know a bird." She hopped to the front of the sled, claws curling around the wood. "I'll guide you, and if you get stuck in a drift that doesn't exist yet, I'll laugh first and help second." "That sounds fair," Braum said. He stood up, shook snowless dust from his vest, and tugged the sled free from the stone. The runners scraped over the bare ground with a small, stubborn squeak. "Let's go ask Winter why it's late," he said, setting the sled straight and taking the first careful step toward the hills. The first part of the journey was along familiar paths. They passed the baker's house, where the smell of bread tried to persuade Braum to stop. They passed the school, where the playground looked strangely unfinished without snow piled in the corners. They passed the square with its empty fountain, where the statue of a fish looked offended by the temperature. "Going somewhere, Braum?" called the fountain fish in its stony voice. It only spoke when the air was cold enough for words to hang for a moment. "To the North Hill," Braum answered. "We're going to knock on the snow gate." The fish's stone eyes did not move, but a crack near his mouth deepened, which might have been a smile. "Bring us a proper winter," it said. "This half-frozen nonsense is bad for my dignity." Braum promised he would try. Beyond the last houses, the road narrowed into a path. The earth grew harder under the runners, then softer where the frost had been broken by hooves and wheels. Dry grass whispered on either side. Ink flew ahead, then circled back, never quite simply riding on the sled. "Keep to the low ground along the quarry," she advised. "The northern wind does strange things at the top." Braum nodded and pulled. For a while, everything was ordinary and small. The sound of the sled, his breath in the cold, the odd flap and croak from Ink, a fox watching from a bush with polite curiosity, a rabbit dashing away, leaving little commas of tracks in the crusted mud. But little by little, the ordinary began to stretch. The land rose gently. The air grew a shade quieter, as if listening to itself. The sky ahead of them looked thicker, like glass, with something pressed on the other side. Braum felt the tug of the hill before he saw it. His paws ached, but he kept going. The sled was heavy, but the thought of children's disappointed faces was heavier. "You can ride for a bit, you know," Ink remarked from her branch. "Tie the rope around yourself and slide. That's the point of sleds." "Upwards?" Braum puffed. "Sleds are not meant for upwards." "That's what you think, but what do I know? I only live here." Braum hesitated, then did as she suggested. He sat on the sled, looped the rope around his middle, and leaned forward. The hill greeted the runners with a small, approving hiss. It was still hard work. Every meter of height had to be earned with pulling and pushing, and occasionally, embarrassingly, scrambling on all fours. But it was easier than dragging the sled by hand, and somehow it felt right, as if the sled understood that they were on their way to its favorite kind of place. The clouds above them grew lower. By the time they reached the first patch of lingering frost on the ground, the town was a toy far behind them, and the lake was just a dull coin in the distance. Ink landed on Braum's shoulder and peered forward. "There," she said softly. The top of the North Hill was not a dramatic peak. It was simply a wide, flattened space where the wind had worn the land down little by little over years. In the center stood 3 stones, each as tall as Braum, leaning toward one another like old friends sharing a secret. Between the 3 stones, the air looked different, thicker, brighter, as if someone had cut an opening into another kind of weather and then forgotten to close it. Braum felt the bell ring without him moving. Tling! The sound went into the air between the stones and did not come back. Ink fluffed her feathers. "I will wait over there," she said, nodding toward a nearby bush. "If anything truly terrible happens, I'll shout vague advice and remember you fondly." "Thank you," Braum murmured. He left the sled at the edge of the circle of stones and walked the last few steps alone. Up close, the air in the middle was almost visible. It bent light, just a little. When Braum reached out a paw, his claws tingled. "Excuse me," he said. "Is this the snow gate?" The hill answered with wind. It came from nowhere and everywhere at once, cold and swift enough to snatch his words and toss them up into the gray. Braum staggered, then planted his feet. "I'm Braum, from the town by the lake. Winter is late. Children are waiting with sleds and mittens. The fields are thirsty for snow. I have come to ask what has happened." The wind circled him. It smelled of pine forests he had never seen and high places where no one walked. Its invisible hands tugged at his vest, his hat, his patience. "Who are you to ask?" it whispered, though the whisper was loud enough to rattle the stones. "You are small. You are warm. You should be by a fire." Braum's bell shook on his cap. "I am someone with the hill behind my ribs," he answered, surprising himself with the words. "And it is empty." The wind paused. Then it laughed, which sounded like leaves blowing over ice. "Very well," it said. "Ask." Braum licked his nose to wet it, which never helped, but always made him feel braver. "Why is the snow so late?" he asked. "Did it lose its way? Is it broken? Has someone stolen it?" "No one steals snow," the wind replied. "It forgets sometimes, or it hesitates. This year, the clouds are full, but the world below has been noisy, busy. So many fires, so many wheels, so many windows that never close. Winter thought perhaps it was not wanted. Braum thought of glowing screens behind glass, of people complaining about cold and wet boots, of cars hissing down the road even when the first frost had come. "Some people don't like you," he admitted, "but some of us need you. Children, fields, quiet places, hills. It isn't winter without snow. It's just waiting." "Waiting," the wind repeated, tasting the word. It blew between the stones and into Braum's vest, as if checking whether he was telling the truth. "And what will you give," it asked at last, "to convince winter to fall here? We have many hills, many lakes, many small bears. Snow is heavy. It must be asked with weight." Braum hadn't expected a bargain. He looked down at himself. He did not own much. Vest, cap, bell, sled. He thought of giving the sled, but the sled belonged to more than just him. It belonged to the hill behind the school, to the children who raced him, to afternoons of shared laughter. He thought of his vest, but that felt like giving away his name. His paw went to his cap. The bell swung, ringing softly. Gling. The bell had been his since he was very small. It had marked his own winters, his first clumsy slides down icy steps, his first snowfall seen from a window when he was too sick to go outside, his first proper hill when he and his father had sat on the sled together. He loved that bell. Maybe that was why it would work. "If you need something heavy," Braum said, slowly, "you may have my bell." Ink, listening from the bush, made a scandalized croak, but the wind only whispered, "Hold it out." Braum took off his cap with numb paws. He cupped the bell between his hands, feeling its smooth metal, the little notch at one side where it had once been dropped on stone, the way it held the cold. "It has heard every winter I remember, and every one I forgot until the snow fell. Take it as proof that we want you to come." He stepped forward and reached into the strange, thick air between the stones. For a moment, he felt nothing. Then something vast and cold and old touched the bell in his paws. There was a sensation like a chord being struck in the dark. The bell rang. It rang not with its small domestic sound, but with something deeper, like the echo of sled runners across miles of snow, like the sigh of forests under weight, like the crunch of the first step on a newly fallen field. The sound went up. The clouds answered. They sagged lower, suddenly heavy. Braum's paws were pushed back gently, as if by invisible hands. When he looked down, the bell was gone. Only his little cap remained. He felt a twist deep in his chest, sharp and proud at once. "Thank you," the wind said, and for the first time its voice was almost soft. "Go home now, Braum of the lake town. Don't dawdle on the hill. Winter does not like to arrive first and find its hosts late." Braum put his cap back on. Without the bell, his head felt strangely light. He turned, legs stiff with cold and with the feeling of having given away a piece of himself, and walked back to the sled. Ink fluttered onto his shoulder. "That was foolish. Very brave. Very foolish. I approve. Come on, before I cry and my tears freeze to my beak." They sat on the sled together. The hill seemed different now. The air buzzed gently, like a song string pulled tight. Braum wrapped his paws around the front of the sled and nodded. "Home." The North Hill did not need to be asked twice. The slope fell away beneath them. The sled, delighted to finally do what it had been made for, leapt forward. Braum's stomach stayed behind for a heartbeat, then caught up. Ink flattened herself against his vest, shrieking with a mixture of terror and joy. Down they flew. The first snowflake hit Braum's nose halfway down. It was followed by another and another. By the time they reached the lower fields, snow was pouring from the sky in thick white whispers, covering the stubble, the ruts, the old stone walls. The sled's runners hissed and sang on the fresh surface. The world narrowed to motion, cold, and the dazzling, dancing confetti of winter at last. Braum laughed, a sound he almost never made quite that loudly. "I did it!" he shouted, to no one and to everything. Ink cackled. "You did something. Now duck, there's a bush." They swerved, missed the bush by a whisker, rattled through a shallow ditch, and shot out onto the road into town. The children were already outside. As snow had begun to fall, they had rushed from houses, grabbing hats and mismatched gloves, abandoning homework and half-finished soup. Now they saw a small brown bear on a sled come hurtling through the whiteness, vest flapping, cap askew, crow clinging to his shoulder. "Braum!" they yelled. Some of them jumped aside. One bold boy tried to run alongside and fell into a drift with a delighted yell. The sled slowed at last near the square. It slid to a gentle stop right in front of the fountain, which now wore a thin sugar coating of snow along its edges. The stone fish looked impressed. "Welcome back," it said. Braum, panting, climbed off the sled. Snow stuck to his fur, his vest, his nose. His paws tingled. His heart felt huge. Above them all, winter kept falling, thick and easy, as if it had never considered staying away. "You did it," one of the girls breathed, staring at him. Her cheeks were pink, her hair dotted with flakes. "You brought it." "Not alone," Braum said at once. "The wind helped. And ink. I am essential in all major weather events." "But you went," the girl insisted. "You climbed the hill. You talked to the sky." Braum shrugged, suddenly shy. "It was lonely and a little frightening, but I kept thinking, what if winter really thought we didn't need it? Someone had to tell it that we do." The children were quiet for a moment, listening to the snow. Then someone whooped. "Race you to the big hill!" another shouted. In an instant, the square was a flurry of running boots and dragged sleds and wild laughter. Braum watched them go, then looked up at the sky. Snowflakes landed on his eyelashes. "Thank you," he said. A wind slid down from somewhere high above, touched his cheek, and went on its way. He thought, just for a moment, that he heard his bell ring inside it, a deep, far sound carried in the storm. Perhaps he had not lost it after all. Perhaps it was just ringing where snow begins. By evening, the town was transformed. Roofs wore soft hats. Streets were lines of light between white banks. The lake had a new, quiet edge. Every railing, bench, and post had gained a small, temporary cousin made of snow. In the small house where Braum lived, a kettle steamed on the stove. He sat on a stool by the window, watching the flakes drift down in a slower, lazier pattern now, that their first rush was over. His vest hung by the fire, drying. His sled leaned against the wall, runners wet and satisfied. His cap lay in his lap. He ran a paw over the spot where the bell had once hung. "I miss you," he told it. Outside, children's voices rose and fell in the dusk. From somewhere high over the roofs came a sound like the faint jingle of bronze in a wide, cold sky. Braum smiled. "I know," he said softly. "You're busy." Ink tapped on the window with her beak. When he opened it a crack, a gust of cold and crow came in. "I have been thinking," she declared, hopping onto the sill. "If you insist on giving away parts of yourself to large invisible forces, you should at least replace them with something." She dropped something small into his paw. It was a seed cone from a spruce tree, dry and neat and perfectly scaled. "Not very loud," she admitted, "but if you sew it onto your cap, it will make the right sound in your head." Braum turned it over. It didn't ring, of course, but as he held it, he felt the sharp, pleasant smell of distant forests, of places where snow lay deeper than roofs, of long blue shadows and quiet. "I like it," he said. He stitched it on clumsily, with thick paws and a bit of mismatched thread. When he put the cap back on, it felt different. Lighter, yes, but when he shook his head, he could hear, faint and secret, the echo of his lost bell in the memory of the stone circle, tlun, like a promise kept. "Better?" Ink asked. "Different, but good," he said. He looked out at the snowy street. Children were still racing up and down, their sleds nothing but dark blurs against the white. Someone had built a small snow bear on the corner, with a stick for a hat and 2 stones for eyes. Tomorrow, he knew, they would drag him out again to the big hill. They would beg him to show them how he rode the North Hill. They would tell the story back to him in a dozen embellished ways. The bear who argued with the sky, who climbed into the clouds, who stole winter back. He would laugh and correct them gently, or not at all. For tonight, it was enough to sit in the warm light, feel the tiredness in his legs, and listen to winter settle over the town like a blanket finally in the right place. Outside, snow kept falling softly. Inside, Braum curled his paws around a mug of hot tea, the steam fogging his nose. "It's good you came," he murmured toward the window. The snow did not answer, but it pressed itself more thickly against the panes, as if leaning in to listen to the little town and the small bear who had gone up a hill to remind the season it was wanted. And somewhere far above the clouds, where the first flakes are born, a bell rang once more, deep and glad, before its echo drifted down into dreams. If one day you stand on a winter hill and feel, for just a moment, that someone has already called the snow for you, perhaps you will remember Braum, a small brown bear in a dark vest and a cap with a pine cone, riding an old sled, brave enough to ask the sky why it was late, and gentle enough to bring the answer back home.
Thank you for spending this piece of winter with me and Braum.
If you'd like to hear more slow stories like this, your likes, comments, and subscriptions really help me to keep creating these little creatures and tales. I'm very grateful you're here.